Okay, evolution. We continue onwards with evolution. We've looked at the first factor of evolution, that is the mutation, right? So how do mutations have a role? It's a direct from one generation to the next, very rapid, possibly very big impact on the phenotype, the genotype of the organism. Right? That's sort of one. Now, another one that I'm not going to do justice, but I do want to introduce at least, the idea of selection. And selection is just a lot tied into selection. I suspect, I might be wrong, but I suspect you've heard of Charles Darwin at some point, right? So Charles Darwin is given credit for the sort of coming up with the idea of natural selection. And I don't know about you, but I like to travel. And I think Darwin had one of the most absolute dream jobs that anybody could have. So to kind of give you a timeline, so 1809, 1882 is when Darwin was around. And early in his life, I'm trying to kind of envision maybe like a zoo, like the El Paso Zoo that we have here, right? So, or San Diego Zoo, something like that. So you would, I guess, on the weekend, in the evening, you take the family, they go see wild animals, that kind of stuff. It was kind of like that, but it was this large museum that he worked in. So, back then they didn't have the internet, they didn't have television. So what did you do with your time, right? So um, basically there was not as much travel as there is today. So if exotic specimens from all over the world were brought into your area, I think it'd be a nice trip. I mean, to go to the museum and check it out. So Darwin basically was given a job and a ship and a crew. And Darwin, go out into the world, go find some cool specimens that will attract people to our museum. And it was more complex than that, but that was sort of his role, right? I'm going to go out, bring some neat stuff back for the study of science, and also to display in the museum, to get people to come spend their money and make profit, right? So that was sort of the basis for Darwin's trip. Now, keep in mind, again, this is in the 1800s. So how wild, how much less population, how much less habitat destruction would there have been in this time? I think it would have been a very, very different scene back then than what we see today. But again, you can notice the trip that Darwin took. So left Europe, stopped in Africa, went down to South America, spent some time in the tropical forest here, the southern tip, worked his way back northward, made famous the Galapagos Islands, right? Discovered these large tortoises, these little finches, went across New Zealand, Australia, Tasmania, back up to Madagascar, South Africa. And I don't know about you, but I dream, at some point in my life to travel to Africa or to Australia. And he did this in a young age. Took about 5 or 6 years. I don't remember the exact time, but multiple year trip. So this was a big deal. And how many amazing things do you think he saw on this voyage? And I think it could have been any one of us that took this voyage. Everything you saw, everything you contemplated, I think you would have been able to come up with some very similar ideas of change and of, how things differ, how things are similar, how vast and complex and diverse life on planet Earth is. So again, a life-changing trip for Darwin for sure. And I think for anyone that would be able to make this kind of biological journey there. So again, after about 5 years, it was time to get back. Probably, boat full of specimens, maybe low on cash, that kind of stuff. So went back and basically started another sort of trajectory of his career. So didn't publish immediately. And I think he would not have published if it were not for this up and coming young, energetic guy, Alfred Wallace. So about 14 years after Darwin's trip, Wallace started to come up with similar ideas of change and of evolution and that kind of stuff. So kind of got together. Darwin was smart guy. He kind of knew what was going to happen once he went public with, with this type of idea that he had. The research was presented in 1858. Darwin got to that conclusion first, so Darwin was given credit, and then he published his book in 1859, The Origin of Species. And that was a big, big, big deal in the history of biology, right? And again, Wallace is overlooked in many, many ideas, many, many cases, but had he not been that little motivator, that instigator, who knows, Darwin may never have published, right? So we might have been talking about Wallaceism, right? But Darwin was given credit. So the big deal, if you ever read Darwin's book, it's a difficult read actually, but the take-home message, and the first time he coined this term, natural selection. All right, what does that mean, natural selection? So Darwin came up with this idea that today doesn't seem like that big of a deal. This was like, wow, this was like earth-shattering back in that time, in the late 1850s there. So this is what Darwin basically says in the book, right? So species change and adapt over time. Right? You hear that and okay, right? But back then somebody read that and I can imagine them reading like, oh my God, what did I just read? Oh, I can't believe he said that, right? So the idea back in the time was that species were created in a divine way, and they were created perfect, so there was no need for them to change. So by him publishing, publishing his idea that, I think species change, and over time they continue to change and they adapt to local environments. That was like heresy. That was like, wow, no, Darwin, you don't say that kind of stuff. You don't even think those kind of thoughts, right? So this is what he proposed in his book. Now understand, this is about 40 years before Gregor Mendel, who discovered the basic concepts of genetics. This is about 100 years before Watson and Crick, who actually discovered DNA. So he knew nothing about the actual genetic process. He didn't understand the sort of the idea, the probability of genetics. He didn't understand the actual molecule DNA. But he just came up with this idea that, based on his observations, species change and adapt over time. I don't know how it happens, but the idea that he produced, or that he thought will produce the change, was natural selection. He called it the agent of change, right? So what caused change? He said, well, it's caused by natural selection, right? So when you notice in this island in the Galapagos, depending on where they lived or which little island they lived on, if there were a lot of little caterpillars and grubs, insects, the finches had this kind of beak, narrow, small little beak. And another island or area where there was large seeds, not a lot of insects, but large seeds, the finches developed these large, big, thick beaks, right? So there was a difference in the beaks depending on where they lived. Depending on where they lived, there was a difference in the beak structures. So what caused that change? Darwin said, well, it's caused by natural selection. The ecology surrounding the organism, they adapt. And because of certain mutations, certain natural variation that exists, some individuals are better adapted for this place, for that place. And this natural process that we define as natural selection. So today we define it as differential reproductive success of individuals. Okay, so differential reproductive success of individuals. So this implies that not every parent has the same number of offspring. And in the realm of natural selection, the more offspring you have, the more DNA that you leave behind, the more successful you were, right? So leaving more offspring. So you have a big family, that's defined as, hey, you're very good in the natural selective process, right? So you might have heard of the term survival of the fittest. That's half correct. So you can be strong and well adapted, but if you don't reproduce, those genes, that DNA sequence dies with you, right? So it's survival, but also reproduction of the fittest. So that's we've got to have that little qualifier there, right? Survival and reproduction of the fittest. If the organism is well adapted to their environment, they will probably live long enough. They're going to be healthy enough to reproduce. If they don't live long, they're going to die. They're not going to leave these genes behind. And that's sort of this natural process of this evolutionary idea. So good genes, strong, fast, enables you to find food, live long enough to avoid being prey, pass on many genes, and that's natural selection, right? If you know a little bit about certain like pack animals, like I should say like a pack of wolves, something like that, not every wolf has the chance to mate. It's only the alpha that mates. So let's say you have 10 wolves there, right? Well, only one dominant wolf is going to leave offspring for several years, right, while they're in power there. So that's that differential reproductive success. Maybe some of you know, maybe some of you are single kids, right? So mom and dad only had one child. So they leave only one offspring with their DNA behind. If you know, like some of our grandmas, some of our older generations, large families, right? One of my mom's aunts had like 17 kids. It's a big family, right? So Darwin would be proud. Yeah, man, that's y'all left a lot of DNA, and that's sort of the idea of natural selection. The more DNA you leave behind, the more genetic sequence pertains to you, the greater success you had, right? Differential reproductive success. I'm going to upload a video link to a really neat project that was done by Dr. Michael Naughtman. And I like to use Dr. Naughtman's sort of video because it's done relatively close to here, right? If you drive up towards Rio Doso and keep going a little bit north west, you run into the Valley of Fire where he did this work, right? So I'll watch the video. I'll let you watch the video, then I'll address this in another video, the future video, and we'll go back and talk about sort of selection, the actual mutation that took place, and we'll address that in more detail. Right? So Darwin, right? Come back to Darwin's idea of natural selection, and this is when he was young. My little dog's snoring here. Let me go there. So So Darwin basically, when he was young, and then Darwin as an old individual, and if you notice, he always looked kind of sad and down. Intelligent guy again, right? He kind of knew that when he presented this work, it was going to be misinterpreted. It was not going to be a welcome, piece of literature, and his career did, take a turn for the worst. He was sort of not hailed as, oh, this is an awesome piece of work. No, things didn't go necessarily that good for him after he published. So again, I'll try to find a video that hints a little bit at his life. And I'm not going to get into the idea of artificial selection. We don't associate Darwin with artificial selection, but it's a kind of a variation of basically natural selection. And I'm talking about this now, and I think it's just going to make more sense today. I will actually record a little video that addresses artificial selection. So I'll do that. Let me stop this one for now so it doesn't get too large, and then we'll progress onwards from there.